All right, let's do a quick lesson on how to multiply radicals. As in class, I mentioned that these steps were pretty good. You're going to want to multiply the coefficients together. Remember, that's the number on the outside of the radical. So coefficient to coefficient. You're going to want to multiply the radicands together, which is the number inside the radical. And when you do that, our product rule tells us that the square root of a times the square root of b will just be the square root of whatever a times b is. So you'll just be multiplying the numbers together as we normally do. And the final part is always to check to see if that radical can be simplified in any way. All right, so let's look at number 1 here. So we want to remember that it's going to be coefficient times coefficient. So the coefficients aren't always out where you can see them because sometimes they're an understood 1. So there's a number here. Those are our coefficients. So there's really a 1. We want to multiply those two numbers together. So 1 times -3 is -3. And then we're going to do our radicand times our radicand. So our radicand times our radicand. So we're going to get 8 times 2, which will give us the square root of 16. The last step says to simplify. So when we look, we know 16 is going to be a perfect square. So we know the radical is going to go away. 16 is 4 times 4. There's your pair. That means you can bring 1 4 out. There's nothing left under the radical. 4 times -3 is -12. And remember, we're still learning to identify rational and irrational numbers. So this one is rational. It's an integer. So it's a rational number. Let's try number 2. So we have coefficients, or numbers on the outside. Coefficient times coefficient. There aren't numbers there, so they are understood 1. So I'm just going to write these in so we can kind of look at them. So we have 1 times -1 is -1. And then you have radicand times radicand. So we have 3 times 2, which is going to give us 6. That's going to be under the radical. 6 can factor down to 2 times 3, but because there's no pairs, we're not going to be able to simplify it any further. So this means this is our answer. -1 root 6. There's a radical remaining in your answer, so it is irrational. Okay. Part of your classwork was to answer questions 3 and 4. And we were not going to do any of the problems with the variables in it. So we're going to skip down to number 9, which had us multiplying and subtracting. So we had to discuss how we have to use the order of operations, which means we're going to do our multiplying first. So we have our coefficient times our coefficient. So we have 10 times 3, which is 30. We have our radicand times our radicand, which will be the square root of 20. And we need to be subtracting off 6 root 5. So now we're down to addition and subtraction like we were doing last week. What we need to do is make sure to see if these will simplify any and see if we can combine them, make them into like terms and combine them. So 20 can be factored down to 4 times 5. The 4 goes again to 2 times 2. So I have a pair of 2's, which means 1's going to come out to the outside to multiply to the coefficient that's already there. This 5 has no pair, so it remains the radicand. So 2 times 30 is 60. Square root 5. We're going to bring down our other term here. These guys are like terms because their radicands match and their indexes match. So your final answer will be 54 root 5. You got a radical remaining, so this is an irrational number. All right, so now we're on the back of our note page, and we're going to make this a little bit more complicated, and we're going to do some distributing. But the rules still hold true, coefficient to coefficient, and radicand to radicand. So let's take a look at our first example here. So our coefficient would be the number in front. This would be a coefficient, and there's the number in front there. So for the time being, I'm going to kind of help us out. I'm going to put ones in to help us kind of see. So I want to take all of this and I want to multiply it here. So we're going to start with our radicand, or coefficient times coefficient. 1 times 3 is 3. Then we're going to have our radicand times, well, there's no radicand there. And when that happens, you're just going to bring down the radical just as it is. So square root 6 is all there is for that one. That's distributing to this first term. Now we're going to distribute to our next term. Remember, it's coefficient times coefficient, so 1 times 1 is 1. And then we have radicand times radicand, which will give us 6 times 8, which is going to be 48. Once we have that, we need to see if they'll simplify. This will go 2 times 3, but because there's no pairs, I'm not going to simplify it down anymore. I'm going to have to leave it. 3 root 6. 48 is 6 times 8. 6 breaks down to 3 times 2. 8, remember our shortcut is 2, 2, 2. And when we're looking for pairs here, I have one pair of 2's, so one's going to come out up here. I have another pair of 2's, that means another 2 is going to come out. And I have the 3 that's going to have to remain behind in the radicand. So for the coefficient, I have 2 times 1, which is 4, with a radicand of 3. These are not like terms, so we cannot combine them. This is going to be our answer right there. So that's distributing a monomial into a binomial, and we went ahead and we worked all the way up to a binomial times a binomial. But the same thing holds true, coefficient times coefficient, radical times radical. So let me mark all of my coefficients. I got a coefficient, I've got a coefficient, I've got a coefficient, and I got a coefficient. This is a 1, and this is a 1. Hopefully that will help us see it pretty well. So I'm going to take 4, and I'm going to distribute it through. So I get 4 times 2, coefficient times coefficient, and I get 8. I need to move to the next one because there's nothing else to multiply to there. I get 4 times -1, coefficient to coefficient, so I get -4. And then I do have a radicand here of 3. When he doesn't have anything to multiply to the other term, you just bring him down. So we got square root 3. So we did our first outer. Let's do our inners. Coefficient times coefficient is 1 times 2 is 2. But there is this radicand here. Radicand times radicand. There isn't anybody for him to multiply it to, so he's just going to come down. And then our final last terms. Coefficient times coefficient, 1 times -1 is -1. Radicand times radicand becomes square root 9. So from here I need to start looking if I can simplify. I see that these guys right here are like terms. So I can go ahead, let's go 8. -4 plus 2 will be -2, and I'll have the root 3 on it. 9 is a perfect square, so that means when I simplify it, the radical is going to go away. That's 3 times 3, which means a single 3 is going to come out. 3 times -1 is -3. Radical's gone because it was a perfect square. That made me have some more like terms. 8 minus 3 is 5 minus 2 root 3. These are not like terms, so I cannot combine them. And that will end our FOIL. So your summary on all of this is it's a lot of moving parts. The math isn't terribly difficult, but you must remember coefficient times coefficient, radicand times radicand, and then simplify. Hopefully this has been helpful to you, and I'll see you in school.